welcome back. This is the second video covering the different calculator tips and tricks for the ACT math test. I already have part 1, so if you haven't seen that, go watch those for more different functions and modes and display things and just some time savers. This one is going to be a bit more advanced, covering things related to graphing. So a quick little outline that you saw in the first one. Part 1 has these topics. If you haven't seen it, go check those out if they look useful. As you can see, I highlighted in red the ones I thought are most helpful. That's all in part 1. Part 2, which I'm going to cover today, these are more advanced. They're more niche, so you don't have to worry about most of these, but if you do know how to use them and the right situation comes up, they can be extremely powerful, especially this 0 one, which I'll get to. But as always, if you find it helpful, leave a like, subscribe, and comment with any questions you might have or anything else you might like to see. So, as I said before, this is going to cover graphing functions. So, that's a lot of things related to graphing, which includes graphing itself. And all of the things we're going to use here can be found in the top row of buttons on your calculator, from the y equals on the left to graph on the right. Again, these can be a bit more complicated, so I recommend you practice them if you're planning to use them on the ACT, because you don't want to stumble around and waste time trying to figure out how they work. If they do take too long, don't worry about it. You don't have to use these. So we'll begin with the standard graphing, which is just graphing an equation to view it, and it can just set up all the other functions we're going to talk about in this video. So for any of those, you're going to end up graphing first. So we're going to start with how do I do that? When would I want to do this? The easiest is just if you have a question where you have to match a graph to an equation. And if you're not sure what that graph would look like, well, you can just put it in your calculator and let it graph it for you, and then just match the picture. The other, I already mentioned, is to set up all the other things that we're going to talk about. You're going to have to graph it first. So how do I do this? The first thing you need to do is get your graph into a y equals format. And what I mean by that is that you have one variable by itself on one side of the equation with nothing else and no exponents. See this y? It's not y squared, it's not 2y, it's just y equals. For some more complicated graphs like circles that have y squared, or anything else with an exponent, those are more complicated. So generally I don't recommend that you do those with your graphing calculator, because you're likely to make a mistake. It can be done with square roots and things, but then you have to be careful of putting both the positive and the negative with two equations to make one. So do not worry about it, you're just going to get confused. So only worry about it graphing on your calculator if you can get a simple y equals format. And just so you know, the variable on the ACT doesn't necessarily have to be y. You can have any letters you want. Just when you put it in your calculator, whichever thing is by itself, we're going to pretend it's y, and whatever's on the other side, we're going to type in as x. But you'll know what the letters actually mean and stand for. So once you have it in the right format, you're going to press the y equals button at the top left of your calculator. And you're going to find that there's multiple rows. There's a y1 equals, a y2 equals, a y3 equals, and so on. So you can actually use each of these to graph multiple functions if you want. So what you're going to want to do next is just type your formula into one of these. I'll use y1 as the example, because typically if you're just graphing one thing, that's the one you're going to go to. It's at the top. So that y1 equals is just replacing the y equals in your formula. So if you have y equals 3x plus 2, you're going to go to the y1 equals that's already there, and on the right side you're going to type 3x plus 2. And that's it. Last thing you'll do is just press graph at the top right of your calculator, and that'll view the graph. And you can adjust the zoom if you wanted to zoom out, zoom in, or anything like that, and the window size using the window and zoom buttons. I'm not going to cover all of their options, but you can use window to type in, I want the x-axis to go from this to that. Same for the y. Whereas the zoom is a little bit more generic, with just zoom in, zoom out, or zoom to fit if you wanted to fit a certain shape. So now that we know how to graph, I wanted to go a bit more advanced graphing that's typically not needed for the ACT, because you should just know your inequality rules. It's typically going to be faster. I have a video on those. But if you ever doubt which side should I be shading, or what's it going to look like for this type of weird advanced graph, don't see a lot of those, but they can show up. You can use the calculator to help you out. So when am I going to do that? Exactly what I was just talking about. If you're matching an inequality graph to an equation. So how do I do this? Just like with your regular graphing, you're just going to type your inequality into the y equals tab, like normal. But for now, just pretend that it's not an equality and it just has an equals sign. So instead of all these, we're going to pretend it's an equals. Then use your cursor to go to the diagonal line that's to the left of the y1 on your calculator. We've been ignoring that diagonal line so far. So, and if you're not using y1, you're using one of the other rows, go to the left of that one. Once you're hovering over that diagonal, it should be flashing. Press enter, and it's going to change that line to different symbols. And those are all going to display different things. You can choose between your standard line, dotted lines, sometimes you have a thicker line, or you can choose to shade or above or below your graph. Those last two are the inequalities. Now, different calculator models might have different options, so feel free to explore that. And do know a lot of inequalities, like if I just have greater than, or if I have, if I have less than or greater than, but no or equal to, I'm going to need to shade one side and have a dotted line. The calculator often doesn't have the option to do both of those, dotted line and shading, so you're going to have to at least remember your inequality rules to tell me, should it be solid or should it be dotted? So, what these are going to look like to replace that diagonal on your calculator is you're going to have one of these two triangles. So this one means less than. In other words, if this diagonal line normally goes from top left to bottom right, now it's shading below it. That's what we're trying to do. And it can also help you remember is that it kind of looks like the less than symbol if you just tilted it to the left just a little bit, or counterclockwise. You get this. Looks like a less than. Whereas this triangle looks like a greater than, that's just tilted left just the same, or counterclockwise. That means more than, which is shading above that diagonal line. So once you've pressed enter to get the correct triangle there, or the right symbol, then you'll press graph, and you'll view it. And it's just going to look just like anything else, but it's going to shade one side according to what you chose. So now let's go to some of the more advanced things, beginning with trace and table. Trace isn't too useful on the ACT. I'll still cover it because it can be handy for a quick check. Table is much more powerful, but it is a bit more advanced. I don't often use it, but it can be used to pretty good effect if you're good with it. So what are they going to do? They're just going to let you actually figure out the exact value of y at specific x values. So I would use these in these situations. Trace, as I said, is less useful. I say less accurate. It still is perfectly accurate with the x and y they give you, but you can't necessarily say, I want to try it for x is 2.38. You just kind of slide along the graph. In other words, you're tracing along the graph, and it's just going to tell you what the x and y is wherever your cursor is. So it's kind of hard to get the exact number you want, but it's good for getting a rough idea of where something is if it's just all you need. Tables more accurate, or I should say more precise, where you can give it specifically, x is this, what's y? This is another really helpful way to try plugging in different answer choices. If they're all going to go into the same formula, you can put that formula into y equals, go to table, and then type in all the different answer choices as x and view what all of those answers will give you. So how do I use these? For either one, you're first going to have to put your equation into y equals. That's going to be the case for every slide here today. Then for trace, all you have to do is press the trace button, which is next to the graph button. You can then use left and right to move your cursor along the graph, and it'll view the values at the bottom of the screen. For table, before you actually go to the table, I'm going to recommend we change one of those settings first. And you only have to do this once because it'll save your settings unless you change them back. So what I would have you do is press the second button and then window. What we're going to is the table set, or in other words, table settings menu. So in blue above window, it's going to have these. It's going to open the table settings. Scroll down to where you see this, which is short for independent variable. In other words, the x variable. And then use your left and right cursor to go over to where it says ask and press enter. What this is going to do is then when you go to the table, it's going to have you type in what x values you want, because otherwise it's just going to autofill some random numbers. Often it's just going to go from 0 to whatever, so you're going to see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and keep counting, and then give you the y for all those x's, which can be nice, but for the ACT we're trying to go fast. We don't want to scroll to whatever we want. We can just tell it exactly what we want and it'll calculate for us. So go to ask and it's going to be way more useful. Next, once you have your setting, you're going to open the table by pressing the second button and then graph. At this point, you're going to have an X column and a Y column. So type whatever X values you want into the X column, or independent, it might label them differently. This is then going to have it calculate Y for those exact X values, and you can see them all on the screen at the same time. And that's all there is to this one. Try it out. It'll take some getting used to, but it can be very helpful for plugging in answer choices. Next up, the most useful one in my opinion is the zero function. And it's not super useful for its intended purpose. It's going to be more useful for the second one I'm going to cover about, or talk about. So first of all, what does it do? It just tells you the x-intercepts of an equation, or where the y equals 0, hence the name. So you could use this just if they're asking you for the x-intercept or the 0 of a formula, or if you're trying to match a graph, which it's very similar but just shifted a little and you just can't tell which one to do. Well, if you can see one has x at 3, or y equals 0 at x is 3, and the other has y equals 0 at x is 5, you can just graph it, use the 0 button to figure out, well, which one is the correct x-intercept. More useful, though, is using this to solve polynomials. So you can just set your polynomial equal to 0 first. So what I mean by this is, let's say you have this polynomial here, and they want you to solve for x. Notice there's no y here, but that's fine. That's where I can get creative. I just have to make one side 0 equals. So right now I have an 8 on the left. I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides, so this minus 1 becomes minus 9, and I'm left with 0 over here. So now, if I wanted to, I can replace that 0 with y, and graph y equals x cubed plus 3x squared minus 9. And so the x-intercepts of that would be where y equals 0. And this is what I'm trying to figure out, is where does x make this side 0? And if that side is y, it's just at what point does x make y 0? Those are the x-intercepts. So I would graph this, use the 0 function, find all the x-intercepts. Those are the solutions to this polynomial. So now I don't have to do factoring or the quadratic formula if it was a quadratic. It's just a quicker way to get there if it's more complicated. So how do I do this? Press the y equal button, enter your equation, like always. Press the second button, and then trace. That's going to go to the calc menu. So you're going to see calc in blue above the trace button. Then you're going to see a list of functions. We're going to go down to 0, where it actually types out 0, not the number 0. All these functions are going to have a number in front of them, just like in the math one. So if you don't want to scroll down and you just can type the number that's in front of it, it might be a little faster. That's up to you. It's just preference. Once you hit that, it's going to pull up the graph of your equation, and it's going to ask you to essentially bookend whatever 0 you're interested in, or x-intercept. So you're just going to say, this is too far to the left, this is too far to the right, but close. So as soon as it pulls up, the bottom of the screen is going to read left bound. So what it wants is for you to move the cursor with the left and right to the point where it's just left of an x-intercept that you want to calculate, and press enter. So it's going to tell it, I'm going to start looking for it here, and then I'm going to look to the right. Then it's going to switch to right bound. So now you're going to move the cursor to the right of whatever x-intercept you want, and press enter. So that's going to say, I'm going to start here and look left, and they're going to go both directions and find the thing that crosses 0 in the middle. So after you press enter, it's going to do a weird thing where it asks you to guess. Ignore that for the ACT. That's for some really advanced stuff. So all you have to do whenever you see guess on the ACT is press enter. Don't do anything. Then, after that, the bottom of the screen is going to give you the x and y value of that x-intercept that you just surrounded with your left and right bound. And the cursor is going to zoom in on that exact spot. Then you just repeat that whole process for each x-intercept if there's several. And that's all there is to it. Do practice this one. It could be really helpful, especially on the back end of the test where it has some really crazy polynomials. So you're not having to factor out trinomials or anything crazy like that. Next, we're going to go to some others that are similar to the 0, a little less useful, but nice when it does come up. The first one is going to be intersect. So what it does is it's going to tell you the x and y value where two equations intersect. On the ACT, I can use this whenever I have two equations that I need to solve. So really this is mostly going to just come up if I'm doing a substitution and elimination problem, where it's going to give me two equations, both with an x and y. They want me to solve this with substitution and elimination. And sometimes that's not too bad to just do properly. But especially later in the test, they can get kind of crazy. So if you wanted to, you can just solve both of them for y equals, and then graph them both and use the intersect to figure out where do they match. And that's going to be your answer. Another time that's a little less common, but would be for these linear word problems, where they might give you two different price models. So let's say we have a streaming service for movies. So company 1 makes you pay a subscription of this many dollars, plus a small fee for every video you want to rent. Whereas company 2 has a cheaper subscription fee, but you have to pay more for every video you want to rent. And then they ask, for how many videos would you have to rent this for them to cost the same amount? So that is essentially another way of setting up these two linear word problems. So you're going to set up these substitution elimination. You just have to write out the formulas yourself first. So again, once you write those out, you could put them in y equals format and use intersect. So how do I do this? First, press the y equal button and enter your equations. This time we'll have two of them, so put it into y1 and y2. Then press second and trace. We're again going to that calc menu. And this time, instead of going to 0, go to intersect, which is normally 5. This is going to pull up the graph of your equations. And this time, instead of asking for left bound, right bound, it's going to first ask first curve. Use your arrow keys and just get close to an intersection point and press enter. Then it's going to switch to, say, second curve, and the cursor is going to switch to the other graph, because remember, there's two of them. Again, just use the arrow keys to go close to that same intersection point and press enter. It's again going to ask for a guess, ignore it and just press enter, and then it's going to zoom in on that intersection point and give you the x and y value at the bottom of the screen. And that's it. So now we'll go to what's probably the least useful of all of these, but it's still helpful in its certain situations, and that's min and max, or minimum or maximum. Those are two different functions. And all they're going to do is tell you exactly that, the x and y coordinates of the minimum or maximum of some parabola. In other words, the valley or the peak. So when would I want to use this? The most obvious would be if they directly ask for the max or the min of some parabola, but that doesn't happen too often. You also might just be trying to match a graph, and you're not quite sure where to put that vertex. You could just graph it and use this to get the exact number if they're kind of close together and you need to know. A less obvious, but just as useful one, is if they ask for something in a word problem, like maximum profit, where they expect you to either come up with the equation and then solve it, or maybe, if you're lucky, they'll give you the equation, and then you can use this graphing function and min-max to just solve it. So how would I do this? Press the y equals button and enter the equation. Press second and then trace to get to that calc menu again. And this time we're looking for minimum or maximum. They might also call them min or max. It's normally 3 or 4 if you're looking for the numbers. Again, it's going to pull up the graph of the equation, and it's going to be exactly like the 0 function, where it's going to ask for the left bound and right bound. But this time, when it asks for the left bound, we're going to go to the left of that min or the max instead of an x-intercept. Press enter. It's going to ask for the right bound, go to the right of that min or max, and press enter. Again, it's going to ask for a guess, ignore that, and just press enter, and it will go straight to that min or max in between the 2 points you chose, and give you the value of the x and y at the bottom of the screen. So that's going to do it for all those graphing ones. The last thing I wanted to talk about is matrix math. And that's just to let you know that your calculators may actually be able to do some matrix math for you. But I don't generally recommend that you take the time to learn these functions, because it can be kind of tough, it can be easy to mess up, and it's often not actually going to be helpful in the ACT. So if it's something you're really good at, it can be quite handy in very specific questions, but normally it's just not worth the time, because you might get situations like this. You might get a conceptual problem, where it's more of a which of these is even possible to do, and they don't give you any numbers. You can't really do that too easily with your calculator unless you make up a whole bunch of different ones, try and plug them all in, but then you have to type in all the matrices, and that's going to take forever. They also might only give you partial information and just require you to solve for one part of the matrix, which is really fast to do by hand if you know how, a lot slower if you have to take the time to go and make up all the partial information just so you can get one little bit. Others might have you work backwards, which you could do by plugging in every single answer choice, but again, unlike other things with a matrix, you have to plug in a whole bunch of numbers to do that in your calculator. It's just not worth it in any of these situations. It either won't be able to help you or it's going to take a really long time. So really, I don't generally recommend you do it unless it's a perfectly straightforward, just solve this matrix math problem. But even then, taking the time to learn how to do that is not really worth it unless you've already got everything else figured out. So, as I said, it can be helpful, but generally just easier to learn how to do the math yourself, and you'll be better off. So that's going to do it for today's video. Hope you found these helpful. I know these were a bit more advanced and a little bit harder to see when to use them. Mainly focus on general graphing and that zero function, I would say. Maybe the trace table, especially the table. But try them out, see what you like, use what you're comfortable with. Good luck, and I'll see you on the next one.